Hello, this is the lecture video for Module 3, Climate Change, Human Dimensions of Sci 333E, Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change at the University of Maine at Augusta. Now, this module should take you about 3 weeks to complete. We have already started this week. Sorry, the video is a little bit late. I've had the flu this week, and this is the first day I've been able to comfortably talk. So let's dive right in. Our topic that we're looking at is obviously the human dimensions of climate change, but particularly we're trying to understand the overlap between the physical sciences of climate change and the human systems that are impacted by climate change. Again, we're looking specifically at the impacts. We have been focusing the last couple of weeks on the human dimensions of disasters. So as disasters are interrupting our human systems, impacting us as individuals, but also as communities, destroying our infrastructure, as they require planning and cognitions and all sorts of processes that we have to put into understanding, planning for, recovering from, responding to disasters. Well, we have a very similar sort of relationship with climate change. In the short term, we have the interactions, the human dimensions of climate change through our human interactions with disasters. But in the much longer term, we also have our planning for, our adaptations to, our mitigation of climate change and how that interacts with all of our human systems, meaning how our governmental policies create mitigation or adaptation responses, or how they don't. That's also one of the human dimensions. All of the debates that we have, all of the pundit arguments about whether or not climate change is real. All of our planning in terms of the way that we build our cities, all of our planning in the way of where we build our cities, trying to move them out of the way of climate change, all of the planning in terms of how our technology is moving toward trying to reduce CO2 emissions, trying to be stronger and better prepared for what we anticipate is going to happen with climate change. All of these things are going to fall under the human dimensions. Now, in the next module, we will be focusing much more specifically on our psychological cognitions. So this will be our thoughts, our understanding, our emotional responses, our psychological trauma we might experience due to climate change. So that's going to be focused much more on the brain and mind element, both with individuals, but also as we experience and understand things together as communities. Here, for the next 3 weeks, I want you to be focusing on understanding, at least in very broad strokes, what is happening to our physical systems with climate change. How are our ocean systems, our atmospheric systems, our water systems, how are these things changing? What are the predictions and projections that we have with climate change? And how do these things affect human people? What are the overlaps between what's happening to the natural environment and what is happening to our human systems and our human environments? That's going to be the human dimensions of climate change. Now, I have a few readings for this module. The first is Climate Change by Philippe Squarzoni. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. He's French. This book was originally published in French and then was translated into English. I found this actually in a bookshop in Bar Harbor a few years ago and was really kind of hesitant when I looked at it, but I did purchase a copy. I read through it and was really impressed that the science is accurate. Now, it was published a few years back, so the science is a little bit outdated, but the science is based on interviews with climate scientists and the IPCC reports, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, where it basically takes all of the science that has happened in the world over the past 4 or 5 years and tries to synthesize it to understand, okay, what do we know overall? And so the science that is in this book is accurate. And I want to really verify that for you because it's a comic book. I say a comic book. It's a graphic novel, but what I really like about this is that the science is readable. It's kind of boiled down into some of our basic human terminologies, like conversations that we might have out in the real world. It's also pitted through Philippe Squarzoni's understanding, his own experience of understanding what is happening with climate change, of learning about climate change, of his own emotional and cognitive response as he's learning all of these things. He goes through a process that many people go through when they're learning about climate change. First, he is a little bit, not skeptical exactly, but just the scope of it doesn't seem right. The more he learns, it just seems like there's more questions and not enough answers. So he decides to look into it more. And the more that he learns, he develops this kind of panic feeling of, oh my God, there is so much. He makes drastic changes in his life and as a response to this. But what human people find is that we can't sustain panic on the long term. We might have increased ambient levels of anxiety, increased awareness and understanding. We might make long-term life changes based on our new understanding of climate change. But it's not possible for us to just be in a constant state of terror and craziness over this thing that's going to be happening and drastically impacting us for the next 50, 100 years, however long we get to live within this world. You can't sustain that lifelong. And so ultimately he has to start balancing out his beliefs, his understanding with climate change, his beliefs and understanding of what people should be doing with the reality of the world that he lives in. Meaning he has to make choices between, okay, I know that this is good for the long-term climate, but I need to do this for my job, so what's the choice I'm going to make? And he starts balancing out those things as well. This is another very common response that we see. It's very likely or possible that if this class is your first introduction into climate change, into the human dimensions of climate change, that you're somewhere in that panic state right about now. It's okay, you can live there for a while if you want, but then also recognize that you're not selling out or letting go when ultimately you do have to, adapt and make changes within the life that we lead. It is absolutely necessary that we as human individuals and as human society, we have to address climate change. We just do. It's happening. And so there's going to need to be some sort of response. And the more proactive we are about this responses, ultimately the better it's going to be for the human race, the better it's going to be for our societies, and the better it's going to be for the environment and for the planet. However, no one person can do it on their own. And so while you may have the response that, oh, I have to just stop all of my emissions right now immediately, you're very welcome to do that. It's your life. But the corollary when people start making these changes and then you look around and see other people are not necessarily making those changes along with me, so are my actions actually having any meaning? That's a common thing that we have to balance. Ultimately, we're going to have to continue to build these movements. And as I like to tell people, these movements are happening regardless of what you're hearing on TV or what you're hearing from politicians. People are active in climate change. I know because I've been doing this for a decade, and I know thousands of people personally who are working actively on climate change around the world. So just because you don't necessarily see this action within your sphere does not mean that it's not happening. So there's that. Another thing I do want to kind of warn you about with this book is that it's very French, like culturally speaking, and so it kind of ends on this note of existential crisis. Like, is there really anything that we can do about this? What's the point of action if so many other people are not acting? And the point of action, of course, is that we have to do this. It's up to the survival of our species at this time. We're not going to be able to prevent climate change any longer. It's going to happen regardless, but how bad it is can still be mitigated. We can still keep it from being catastrophic. And so we do have to continue to act. We need to continue to have these conversations. We need to continue educating people and pushing our laws in our communities and the companies and corporations that are directing all of these aspects of our society. We need to keep pushing them to direct more resources toward preparing for climate change, because It's what we need to do. We have to do it. So I apologize for the downer note at the end of the book. However, you can read that and think, yeah, this is awful, but then please think, oh yes, but Katie says she knows thousands of people, and all hope is not yet lost. It's very important to me. Statistically speaking, since I've been using this book, I have found that in every class I've used this for, about 10% of the class, it just doesn't work. The format with the graphic novel and the science, it's distracting. It just doesn't work within their learning style or the way that they read or understand material. And if that's you, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Put the book aside if you are not learning from it, if you're just getting frustrated by it. And instead, I want to direct you to the link that I provided in the module. It's on our syllabus, but it is also on our Blackboard site. It's the very top link called Climate Change 2014 Assessment, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. This is from the IPCC 2014 report. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is not the full report. The full report is many hundreds of pages long. It covers all aspects of the science that was synthesized over a years-long process by hundreds of scientists around the world. I'm not going to make you read all of that. You're welcome to. It's really cool. But if you are having difficulty, especially with this book, I want to direct you to this, because what this is the Working Group 2 Summary for Policymakers. Working Group 2 was looking at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So it's specifically looking at the projections for what is going to happen to human societies. How are human societies and human individuals going to be vulnerable? What are we already seeing so far? And what can we project is going to be happening in the near and long-term future? Now, it's a summary for policymakers, which means that it's in readable language. You will not necessarily understand all of it because, again, within this class, within this field, there is such a broad range of topics and expertise. It is pretty much literally impossible for any one person to become an expert in all of them. So as you're reading through, understand what you can understand. Things that you don't quite get, it's probably okay that you don't quite get them. Just keep reading and find the next thing that you can understand and focus in on that. The content also, even if you do read the Climate Changed book, the content is the more updated report. So Philip Squarzoni's book was based, I think, on the 2007 report, certainly one of the older ones because it was published some years back. So this is the more updated information. One of the things that we're seeing as we update this information and continue to conduct more and more research, fold in more science and more knowledge, but then also have more time pass so that our observations are basically filling out. We're getting a lot more data about what is already happening with climate change that we can fold into this science as well, is that we are developing a much more thick, rich, nuanced understanding of the science of climate change. Our projections are getting better all of the time, and they'll continue to improve on into the future. We're getting a better sense of what is happening within our projections on into the future. We're getting a better sense of where we fall within the different scenarios of possible outcomes. Now, in the IPCC reports within this summary for policymakers, also I'm including, a link to like the entire full report if you want to skim through and look through what other types of information are available within this report. It's seriously an impressive amount of knowledge that is gathered here together. The IPCC reports, all of the projections on into the future, are based on different scenarios of what people might do on into the future and how that is going to impact climate change. Now, we do have choices, and what choices we make as an entire global population are going to affect the outcomes that we see with climate change. If we stop emitting all greenhouse gases, all carbon emissions, everything, we shut down all industry, we turn off all the power, we never drive a car again, etc., etc. Tomorrow, there's still going to be climate change. The changes that we're going to see are going to be relatively mild over the next 100 or 200 years, but there are already so many greenhouse gases in the environment that we're already going to see the warming. We're already seeing the kind of decoupling of our natural systems away from the systems as they should be, because we've had influence on them, we've had impact on them as a human species. There's also the next scenario is if we have low growth, basically. So we do our very best to curb emissions in a reasonable way so that we're not just shutting off all the power and stopping all industry, but basically like making extreme cuts in the amount of greenhouse gases. We're still going to see climate change happening, but again, it's going to be not as bad as it could possibly be. It'll be a little bit worse than if we cut off all the power tomorrow, but it's not going to be at the catastrophic level. Our moderate growth, we put a kind of effort into it. We make some reductions, but there's still some growth, and so there's still some increases in emissions some places, and it takes longer for us to get there. The moderate growth scenario is going to be one of the outcomes, and typically that's what policymakers are going to focus in on. People like to kind of look at the median, not the high extreme, not the low extreme. People are very comfortable typically making choices based on the middle ground. However, the middle ground is not where a lot of our actions have been so far. Instead, our actions have been much more in line with the we as a human species make no change. We continue to develop and to grow and to burn fossil fuels and to have our industries creating all of the greenhouse gases that they're creating, basically along the same process that we're seeing right now on into the future. And those projections are pretty catastrophic if we do absolutely nothing and just continue on as we are. So far in the decades that we have been observing these impacts and observing our projections as the time comes up, where did we fall within these projections? So far we have outpaced every worst case scenario. So that does not give us a lot of hope for the future if we do nothing, which again is why we kind of have to do something. We have to put these efforts forth. And again, you're taking this class, you're learning about these things, so welcome, you're part of the solution now. You get to speak out, you get to connect with people who are in charge and make decisions, and give them pieces of your knowledge and the things that you've learned in order to try to influence those decisions in positive ways. What we have for our assignments for this module, I want you to do the reading reflection, which will be to answer these questions, describe at least 5 physical, and this will be the natural or environmental systems that will be disrupted or altered extensively due to climate change, and of course cite appropriately. If you're citing from the book Climate Changed, I do want you to cite the author, but also he's interviewing a lot of different scientists, so where exactly does that information come from? If it's a scientist that he has interviewed that says XYZ, also cite that scientist. If he's citing a report and there will be like the little asterisks at the bottom of the page where he cites his sources, put that source in as well, just so that you're aware of where this information is actually coming from. I also want you to be thinking about, for each of those physical systems that you identify that are experiencing some sort of change, increased storms, sea level rise, atmospheric changes, etc., etc., what are 2 ways in which human populations might be impacted or will be impacted, or in some cases have already been impacted? So start thinking about what's happening with the physical environment and what's happening to the people who live there. Yeah. The second assignment is the information and misinformation in the real world. I want you to find a recent report from sometime in this past year. This can be a news article or a video that talks in some depth about scientific findings or projections for climate change. It can be narrowly focused on one particular potential impact. For example, we have had, billions now of hurricanes this season. Maybe there's a report talking about the hurricanes and climate change projections, maybe something else. There are a lot of different potential impacts once again. So find something that kind of calls your attention. Describe to me within this, what is this report about? So, I know you've read it and you understand it. And to the best of your ability, I want you to identify where the information in that report comes from. If it's written by a journalist, the journalist didn't do the research in order to figure out about sea level rise. They went and talked to other people, or they went and read science that has research that has come out and been published somewhere. So try to figure out, where does that information originate from? What is the original source of that information? And again, to the best of your ability, think about that source. Do you think that it's trustworthy? Do you think it's valid? Do you think it's just some guy in his basement that's making stuff up and uses smart sounding words? Or is this science actually coming from somewhere that is trustworthy and is valid? And I want you to think about those sorts of things. So this module is going to be due on October 15th at midnight. As always, let me know if you have any questions.